Well, back to another week of pandemic and quarantine for those of you who are fortunate enough to be quarantined. It's really a trifecta. It is not just a pandemic, the worst public health crisis in over 100 years in the United States, but we also have an economic crisis. And on Friday, we learned that in April, 20 million Americans lost their jobs. In fact, the unemployment rate is probably closer overall to about 22%. It's heading up to 25%, and that is Great Depression territory. So when I say trifecta, I mean that there's a third problem here, a third reason to be despairing, if you want to be despairing, or certainly worry about America. And it's not just the pandemic, it's not just the economy, it is also the Trump White House. Because, a pandemic would be bad enough, obviously. I mean, we're almost 80,000 Americans who have died from this disease and countless more who are exposed to it. And an economy that is, small businesses. The last data I have seen over the weekend showed that about half of all small businesses may end up closing in America. We have had nothing close to this, but we have somebody in charge of the United States and the United States government, a president who is utterly incompetent. So if the first two were not bad enough, the fact that Donald Trump is in charge of this is making everything far worse than it needed to be, not only in terms of being late to recognize the pandemic and being disorganized and chaotic and responding to it still is totally chaotic, but also with regard to the economy. I mean, there is nothing that the Trump administration wants to do except provide what? Tax cuts, right? Capital gains tax cuts. They're talking about also cutting tax cuts for businesses and for the wealthy, and eliminate all sorts of taxes that businesses. Well, that's all trickle-down economics, folks. That's what Ronald Reagan tried. It's what George W. Bush tried. Trickle-down economics, can we be clear, it does not work. It does not work under normal circumstances. It doesn't work in an economic crisis. It does not work when we have the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. It doesn't work yet when we have a pandemic. Trickle-down economics is nonsense. It just rewards the rich and big corporations, and everybody else is in dire straits. We'll get in later on. I want to get to your questions, and some of your questions are about what we do. But let me just say that Donald Trump reminds me a lot in terms of the economy of Herbert Hoover in 1932. Herbert Hoover was president during the great crash of 1929, and the economy came to a complete standstill. We got into the Great Depression. And what did President Herbert Hoover say when people said, what should be done? He said, nothing. Everything will be fine. If anything, cut taxes. I mean, Herbert Hoover basically was a do-nothing president. We have another do-nothing president. Now, it's not that Donald Trump is doing nothing. He spent most of the weekend tweeting. I don't know. I hope you didn't have to be exposed to any of this. I do, because I'm kind of curious, and I have a kind of a self-flagellation instinct with regard to his tweets. But Donald Trump, all he did was tweet about what? About Barack Obama. Barack Obama criticizing him. So in other words, instead of commiserating with families that have lost loved ones in this pandemic, instead of talking about what he is going to do about the economic crisis, instead of talking about the problems of America and the problems of Americans, what does Donald Trump do? He spends his entire weekend, more tweets than he's ever emitted in a single weekend, about his grievances with Barack Obama and how Barack Obama actually started all of this. Please, Donald Trump is a sociopath, and he can only think about himself at a time like this. So that's the trifecta. It is the pandemic, it is the economic crisis, and it is also Donald Trump being in charge. And the pandemic is now moving into red states. I mean, we are the only country in the world facing this pandemic that is actually opening our economy when the number of people and also the rate of infections and the rate of death continues to rise. Everybody else that is beginning to open in Europe and in Japan, elsewhere, they're waiting until actually you get over that worst part of the crisis, and there are fewer infections and fewer deaths, not in the United States. We are actually opening up. And where are we opening up? We're opening up in states that are showing increases, dramatic increases in deaths and disease and infections. That's what our response is to this. And they are red states right now. Many of them rural states. They are now, whether they're meat packers or they are warehouses or they are other farm workers, they are now being infected by this. The rate is increasing there. It's even increasing in the White House itself. The White House itself is becoming a center of the pandemic, a hotspot for the pandemic. There are at least 2 people who have been infected, and a lot of people in the White House. 3 from the Center for Disease Control, including Anthony Fauci, is now quarantining themselves. You know, I've been in the White House. I've served in the White House, 3 separate administrations. I can tell you the White House is very, very compact in terms of everybody packed in there. Everybody wants to be very close to the president. So in the West Wing, what you have is little tight little compartments, everybody on top of each other. It is like in the White House, like a meat packing factory, except instead of packing meat, they're packing politics and policy, but it is basically the same kind of confined space. OSHA, if it was doing its job, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, would not let people go into the White House in those numbers and without masks. And without adequate testing. Yes, they're doing a lot of testing. In fact, that raises another question, which is how is it that the White House is doing all of this testing and can do all of this testing, and everybody else in hotspots around America cannot? That's another issue. But I bring it up really to illustrate the fact that as America opens up, as the Trump administration wants everybody to be much more lenient about shutdowns and about all of the distancing, social distancing requirements, what's happening in the White House itself is a model of why we shouldn't be opening up and doing all of that. And let me just add one further note about all of that, and that is if the president is incapacitated because of the coronavirus, and if the vice president, Pence, is incapacitated because of the coronavirus, then who becomes acting president? And this must be Trump's real nightmare. The acting president of the United States, if the president and vice president are both incapacitated because of the coronavirus, the acting president becomes Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House. So there is worry, deep worry in the White House. Meanwhile, just to make the trifecta even worse, and the theme this morning is trifecta, not to make it, just to make it worse, we've got who in the Senate, who is presiding over the Senate, probably the worst person you have ever seen in the Senate. And that is obviously Mitch McConnell. And Mitch McConnell is making the Senate a do-nothing chamber. He complains about the House being do-nothing, but actually nothing has happened in the Senate. McConnell is sitting on all sorts of pieces of legislation that had come to him from the House, and he refuses to even bring it up to the Senate. And he says, no, we're not going to even consider any more legislation with regard to the pandemic. I'm not going to do another thing with regard to legislation. Well, Mitch McConnell, all he wants to do is fill the federal courts with basically Republican cronies, conservative judges. That's what Mitch McConnell is spending his time on during this pandemic and economic crisis. And then we also have William Barr, as if this trifecta was not bad enough. William Barr at the Justice Department is turning he's already turned the Justice Department into an agency of the president, politically. I mean, look, I'm old enough, I remember Watergate. One of the most important lessons from the Watergate years, from Richard Nixon, is you wanted to have an independent Department of Justice, independent from the president, so it would not be politicized. So people would not worry that justice in America was a matter of what the president wanted for his next election. And that was the lesson of Watergate. That was the lesson of Richard Nixon. But the lesson has been completely lost on this president and this attorney general. In William Barr, Donald Trump has an attorney general who will do his bidding, who will, for example, decide that Mike Flynn goes free, charges dropped, even though Mike Flynn has admitted twice that he committed perjury, that he lied to the FBI. Doesn't matter. Well, he's now, the Justice Department is dropping charges against Michael Flynn. And that it comes on top of all of the other ways in which Barr has basically said to the American public, I don't care about justice, equal justice, the rule of law. I care only about Donald Trump. And so when it came to Roger Stone, William Barr, he interfered in the prosecutor's decisions with regard to what Roger Stone was going to be getting as a matter of punishment. You remember that. There were several prosecutors who resigned over that. And beyond that, there was Mueller and his reinterpretation of Mueller. And you have William Barr deciding for himself that he thinks that, well, maybe Donald Trump is correct. Maybe there was something wrong at the FBI in terms of the investigation of the Mueller investigation to begin with. Maybe there was, the FBI was corrupted. That's what Trump thinks. That's what, despite an inspector general report by the Justice Department itself, its own inspector general, saying that the FBI had clearly enough evidence to launch its Russian investigation. What does William Barr do? He starts another investigation to try to come up with some sort of evidence that, in fact, the FBI had it against Trump. This is what Trump wants. This is what Russia wants. This is a Justice Department that is corrupt, just like the Justice Department of John Mitchell in the Nixon years. And I think that it is logical, isn't it, that William Barr ought to be impeached. William Barr ought to be treated just like John Mitchell. John Mitchell, by the way, spent a lot of time behind bars, okay? And I'm not talking about William Barrs, and I'm not talking about bars in which you go in to get a drink. I'm talking about jail. If you can't run the Justice Department as the Justice Department should be run for the purpose of justice, then you at least ought to be impeached. And if you've done things wrong, and I think William Barr, there's a lot of evidence that he has actually been corrupted, then he goes to jail. Now, on that note, let me just say, several of you and many of you have sent in questions. You want to know, well, what can you do? This is beyond outrage in terms of Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell and William Barr. Get rid of all of them. The answer is out with all of them, out with all of the Republicans. November 3rd is election day. Less than 6 months from now, let's get rid of all of them. Oh, by the way, I just wanted to, this week, tomorrow, in fact, there's going to be a Supreme Court oral argument in a very important case. And I want to remind you of this because this is also about the rule of law, and it's about the trifecta we are now dealing with, particularly Donald Trump. And the question before the Supreme Court tomorrow is, can prosecutors gather evidence about Donald Trump's activities before he was president? And Donald Trump is arguing, no, you can't, because a president, I'm immune. I am immune. I am above the law. I can't even be investigated for anything, even for things that occurred before my presidency. Well, the Supreme Court has before, I remember, because I was there in the Clinton administration when the Supreme Court decided that Paula Jones, you maybe remember Paula Jones, she was trying to get information about some activities of Bill Clinton before the Clinton presidency, went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, of course you can have that information because a president is not above the law And certainly an investigation of a president can go forward on issues that occurred before a president was even president. So if the Supreme Court decides otherwise and overturns that precedent, then we know the Supreme Court itself has been corrupted. Again, November 3rd, folks, November 3rd, Election Day. Sweep these people out. I'm talking about elected officials out, Republicans out. All right, your questions. James Vega, do you support Trump's idea of a payroll tax cut? No, James. I just got finished saying it's just another more trickle-down economics, and the payroll tax cut would benefit people who are very, very wealthy more than they would anybody else. And the wealthy don't spend as much as the poor and the middle class and the working class on whenever they have any money, whatever money they have. And so it would be counterproductive and unfair. David Cahill, what needs to be included in a second, more lengthy monthly stimulus package for the people? David, I think that what we ought to do is just have basically $2,000 per month for every adult until the unemployment rate is down to 5%. And the payroll guarantee is also important. One of you, Jake Bernstein, you said, I follow you on Twitter and noticed yesterday that Elon Musk called you a boring idiot in Russian. What is this? What's your response to this? Do you have a message back from Mr. Musk? Jake, I've taken a lot of people over my lifetime and my career have called me a lot of names. Elon Musk, if you are watching this, and you're probably not, but Elon, let me just say a few things to you. You can call me names. I don't care about that. The reason that I criticized you, and you got very upset apparently with my criticism of you, the reason that I criticized you, Elon Musk, is because you threatened to close your factory in Fremont, California, and your headquarters, and move it out of California because the public health authorities said you could not reopen your Tesla factory because it was unsafe for your workers. And so what do? You threaten to close it and move the jobs away. Elon, do you understand me? You can call me names. That doesn't make any difference. That's not the issue. The issue is public health. We are in a public health emergency. 80,000 Americans have died. Workers need to be protected. Your workers need to be protected. You should keep them on the payroll, and you should not resume production until public health authorities say it is safe. And by threatening to move your factory, you are putting workers in the position of having to choose between either their health or their livelihood. And Elon, that is unfair. It is unworthy of you. I have a lot of respect for you. You are, look, I admire you. You are a brilliant inventor. You are a visionary. That's terrific. But you also have some public responsibilities. You have responsibilities to your workers, especially in this pandemic. Do you get it? You played down this pandemic right in January. I remember you said, this is just like a seasonal flu. This is nothing. That's what you said in January. And then in March, you refused to close down your factory, even when public health officials said that factories needed to be closed. You said it was nothing. And you required, in fact, they ordered you. Finally, they had to order you to close down to protect your workers. And now you're suing Alameda County, and you are threatening to move. And last week, you say you accuse them of being fascists. Elon, look, you can be brilliant, but you got to understand you have some public responsibilities here. Elon, grow up. Now back to your questions, other questions. Stacy Van Houten, why do we hear about the stock market every day as a proxy for the economy? What measure should we hear instead? Stacy, The stock market really has nothing to do with the economy. It is just investors and what they expect to happen in the future. It's their best guess about the future, and every investor, big investor, is competing against every other big investor. They want to be the first, and so the stock market is going to go up and down. It's not going to really reflect the real economy. The most important things you can look at are, number one, the percentage of people who are employed in the United States. The employment population ratio, now it's down to about 51% of people are employed in America. That is really dangerous. It is, we're talking about Great Depression. You also want to look at wages, the median wage. The median wage right now is about stuck where it has been for the last 40 years, adjusted for inflation, even people who still do have their jobs. And that's going to be a huge problem in terms of getting out of this recession depression. Because if people don't have jobs, they don't have any money. And the people who do have jobs don't have much money. And so, you have to have consumers with money to get out of a recession or a depression. Jelena Mikovich, how quickly can Medicare for all pass if we, the people, demand it? Well, Jelena, the good news is that more and more people want Medicare for all. It was very popular even before the pandemic. Now people see we have almost 10 million people who have lost their health insurance, their employer-provided health insurance, and so they have to have some sort of Medicare for all. And by the way, Republicans are in trouble this coming election day because many people remember that they wanted to get rid of Obamacare. They wanted to get rid of even what we have so far. Republicans are at this moment, and the White House is at this moment, in federal court, arguing that the entire Obamacare ought to be eliminated, including people with pre-existing conditions, and Republicans ought to, and Republican voters ought to know about that. Connie Spurlock, our Governor Mike DeWine, you must be in Ohio, Connie, is cutting $200 million from Medicaid in our state. Well, that's something else. Republicans, you in red states, your governors are cutting Medicaid, making it harder for you to deal with this pandemic. What can we do about it, Connie says? Well, Michael DeWine, as I remember, is up for re-election in 2022. So for the next 2 years, there's not much you can do about it. And Republicans control both houses, the Ohio legislature and the Ohio Senate. But here's the hope in Ohio. Now, those of you who are not in Ohio, this may be relevant to you too, because Ohio has new rules to try to avoid the excessive gerrymandering that has infected Ohio. And those rules actually may lead to a commission that, like in California, is independent of politics and can design congressional districts so to avoid gerrymandering. And that's good news. Mark Higgins. Are we caught in a perfect storm? The worst president, the worst Senate Majority Leader, and worst Attorney General ever, all at the same time. How do we get out? Yes, we are, Mark, as I've talked about in my trifecta discussion this morning. And there is no easy way of getting out immediately. That's why the election coming up is so important. Everything we are now experiencing, the pandemic, the economy, and the Depression era economy that comes out of that pandemic, but also has other sources right now. All of that is made worse by having the worst president in the nation's history. You have a pandemic that is the worst health crisis in 100 years. You have an economy that is the worst economy since the Great Depression of the 1930s and the worst president in history. Well, how do we deal with that? The most important thing we deal with, Mark, the perfect storm, the way we deal with it is we mobilize and we organize for 6 months from now, for November 3rd, and we get these people out of office. That is critical, including Mitch McConnell, including replacing the Senate with people who care about the public and who care about working people. One of the great disasters here is that Donald Trump has persuaded so many of his followers that he's acting in their interests when in fact he's doing just the opposite. He's a great Trojan horse for the oligarchy in America. In any event, I've got to stop, and I will be back with you later this week. Please do join us for the common good, and I will also see you next Monday. Have a good week.